Welcome. This is my prepared remarks, but we're an intimate enough group, so please interject any comment or ask any question at any point. Presenting on scaling community decision making. Where I'm coming from is a worker-owned cooperative. Been doing this since 2006. The level of decision-making scaling we've had to do there has not been large. We've never been more than 5 people. So this talk is coming from my experiences in the broader community, including the Drutopia initiative, which is very intentionally trying to be a more inclusive, more democratic space inside Drupal, while at the same time opening up the involvement of the project to non-developers, which again, by open source standards, Drupal's done a great job of, but there's still like a big disconnect between sort of end users and the software project. And Drutopia is trying to bridge that, which increases the potential scale of community decision making immensely. But mostly where I'm coming from is that everything is broken in the world in general. It's not just specific to Drupal, and that there's a great deal, a number of things that we need to fix. This is Minneapolis native son Bob Dylan. Did not even remember the song, but it's decent. So, final place where I'm coming from is that the solution to broken things, which are mostly having to do with power inequalities, people not having control over their own lives, is that the uniting thesis for things I'm trying to do is the most power possible to all people over their own lives, and usually just say what are we in favor of? Justice and liberty. It's prettier and it's to say, and it's more going to be generally accepted, but it's harder to make sure that we're talking about the same thing. There's, famous, terrible economists like Friedrich Hayek, who made a whole career of defining liberty as the right of rich people to do whatever they want with their property. And so if we talk about power over our own lives, it's a bit more concrete and a bit clearer. As much fun as it would be to destroy Hayek's arguments, which hinge on claiming a person in a pit is as free as a person not in a pit, it's better to avoid confusion at the start. So, trying to give power to the people. Fortunately, of course, people are a problem. The problem there, sort of positing that better decision-making structures are the solution, so it's worth being clear what the problem is, and we are the problem. I put this here because I'm obviously a very pro-democracy, power to the people sort of person, but if we're not thinking of our solutions in terms of what is broken about how we organize ourselves and how to make sure we do better, whatever we put in place is going to become part of the problem also. So the good news is we are problematic in sort of consistent ways, and there's lots of stuff that we can do to make ourselves better collectively and individually. And there's pretty awesome literature and research on this, but it's I'm blanking, but I'll look it up, put it in notes afterwards. But I think, like the Overcoming Cognitive Biases Wikipedia page. It's just like, here are all the ways we know that we don't think that clearly and ways to fix that. And that's, a very individual thing, but in a way this talk on decision making is, and even more broadly governance, is just a small subset of ways to work around known bugs in the human condition. One of those little bugs is that no one really cares about decision-making processes until there's something they don't like. And then there's a reason to care, and usually it's too late then in communities. So again, looking at the big the big things that to be fixed, and touch on it later, but fundamentally inequalities of power. And what is power? It's organization. So it is something that can be reclaimed through organizing. As Marian Kaba, Prison Culture on Twitter, who's highly knowledgeable on very long time organizer on very difficult things, ending violence, dismantling the prison industrial complex, practicing transformative justice. As she says, and had a lot of success in organizing, knowledge is not power. It's the organizing that is power. Bad news for free software projects is free software contributors are famously hard to organize. The metaphor of cat herding is used constantly, and more often to refer to software developers, I think, than anything else, at least based on the search for memes relating cat herding. And again, I tend to fixate on injustices caused by an unorganized, unaccountable minority making decisions affecting a much larger but unorganized majority. But there are plenty of problems that have little or nothing to do with the problem of concentrated benefit and distributed costs. They're still problems just because we as society aren't good enough at organizing. There's some low-hanging fruit in the world of better large-scale decision-making, and traffic jams are one example. They affect millions of people who might not be the absolute wealthiest, but they're still relatively privileged, powerful people, and we just don't get our act together to fix it. The sort of issues that a software community deals with are even more amenable to fixing things without stepping on anybody's toes, and in a lot of ways without having to reshape our physical infrastructure of the world. As far as traffic jams, of course, self-driving cars will fix that. This is not a self-driving car, but it is a car that's hooked up to the online through its media system. So it has the ability to have its steering disabled remotely. So it's a precursor to what self-driving cars can bring us. And of course, self-driving cars have already killed people, and these are decision-making problems also. These are people making decisions that it's more important for near-term profit to go for the of getting something out there quickly than to get out there. And then it's a larger problem that we aren't coordinated enough to do something and care about it. But it's an area where we, in technology, sort of have a responsibility to try to self-organize, and we're getting there. Very recently, a bunch of engineers and others who worked at Google able to stop a Google contract with the Pentagon for doing artificial intelligent bombs by just saying they weren't going to do it, and Google actually backed out. So it's a very small bit of power of organization that we have in the tech sector, and we can use it for a lot of things. And I guess so the final thing of where I'm coming from is sort of in the context of one initiative in Drupal, the Drupal Diversity and Inclusion Initiative. I think that to really get something like that right, it's that you have to acknowledge that there's major injustices in the world, and it's the responsibility of all of us everywhere to try to do something about it. And so I'm talking about trying to build power in order to work towards justice, and then in the organizations we build power in to make sure that we don't perpetrate any injustices there. But coming back to Earth, starting with open source projects. According to OLO, half of all open source projects have only one committer. These projects don't have to worry about scaling decision making, and you can really understand why anyone starting a project doesn't think about that. And of course, most Drupal modules are in a similar position. I wasn't able to run the numbers. I'd be interested to see if the Drupal ecosystem, because we do have a good fair amount of sense of community and the ability to draw on another, more than when someone just throws something up on GitHub and hopes it works out. I'd like to see if our numbers are better. I imagine they'd be slightly, but still, the majority of projects, including code that we rely on a lot, are going to be largely run by one person. But a lot scale beyond that, and of course, Drupal itself has. And so you can understand why people don't think about how to scale the community and how to distribute power in the community when it starts out, because there often is no community when it starts out, and sort of putting too much structure too fast would sort of probably crush it. Like adding processes when you're just a few people would probably slow things down enough that it wouldn't get off the ground. And so, fortunately for us, this isn't any problem to Drupal or software. In fact, there's actually a lot of similarities in the open source projects to radical feminist groups in the 1960s. So, to take a quote and just change it slightly, during the years in which the open source movement has been taking shape, a great emphasis has been placed on leaderless, open, structureless groups in the main, as the main, if not the sole, organized form of the movement. The source of this idea was a natural reaction against the overstructured corporations and universities in which most of us found ourselves, and the inevitable control this gave others over our lives. And the and the idea of openness and structurelessness has moved from a healthy counter to these tendencies to become a goddess in its own right. The idea is as little examined as the term is much used, but it has become an intrinsic and unquestioned part of open source philosophy. For the early development of the movement, this did not much matter. It early defined its main goal and its main method as writing working code and spreading awareness, and the structureless open group was an excellent means for this end. The looseness and informality of it encouraged participation and discussion, and its often supportive atmosphere elicited personal insight, if nothing more concrete than personal itch scratching and insight ever resulted from these groups. That did not matter much because their purpose did not extend beyond this. And that is from the beginning of Joe Freeman's essay, The Tyranny of Structurelessness, 1970, with just a few words for feminist groups and open source philosophy to change it. But the essay is fantastic and has a lot of parallels that is useful to learn from. The basic thesis of the essay is that for everyone to have the opportunity to be involved in a given group and to participate in its activities, the structure must be explicit, not implicit. And so the challenge is to how to give that structure without prematurely doing it. So the whole essay is very short. It's fantastic, and the problem with the point of the essay is the problem with groups that don't have explicit structure is that inevitably elitist and exclusive informal communication comes up, and it's not nefarious. It's not intentionally exclusionary, but if there's no formal processes, then the informal communication is in networks of friends. And as she wrote, it is not a new phenomenon, and she wrote that in 1970. So, what are the decision-making structures in Drupal? What is Drupal's structure? Benevolent dictator for life? Yeah. I think we're more of a constitutional dictatorship. We have the Drupal Association with Dries written in as a special thing. So that's one element. But I mean, do you think people wait around for Dries to tell them what to commit, what to work on? Yeah. So I feel that the other main word that sort of defines Drupal is a do-ocracy. If you want something, you go out and do it. So it's very open, it's unstructured, relies heavily on people with free time, which again is it in itself an issue for how software develops. It's built to meet the needs of people who are more privileged rather than people who are less, because the people who are more privileged are the ones who actually have the time to work on it. But essentially the structures that are sort of well defined are, you can go out and do something on your own, and when decisions have to be made centrally, it is really sort of Dries or someone Dries has appointed, or to some extent the structure of the Drupal Association, which has a few elected members, but most are sort of self-selected, and it's none of it's that clear from the ground. There isn't any mechanism for truly, all 1,000 contributors, direct contributors to Drupal core, several thousand, or, all tens of thousands of people who are actually affected by Drupal to participate in decisions that affect them, or to decide what decisions those should be. And this is really shown in the stresses in Drupal. Whatever people think about various decisions that have been made by Dries, everyone agrees that the process was bad. And then the really smart people who are working on making the process better feel very blocked, because, the one thing that, a lot of stuff you can just go out and go ahead and do. You can start a new module. But the people who are thinking about how to improve the governance in Drupal feel that there is no way to change the governance model without going through Dries. And so you have a one-person bottleneck, and that's never going to work well. We are at a point where we could definitely use improvements to governance, and even for the worst reason, the weakest reason that you need some sort of democratic governance is for people to feel heard, for people to have a feeling of influence, of being heard, and that is, that's just the feeling of it. So to have some sort of a clear, transparent structure that people feel they have a reasonable chance of impacting. So just Drutopia has a lot of big decisions to make, and we're not that on much structure yet. So if you're interested, this is a good thing. It's a good time to get involved in a project that's trying to get these things right. Yes?
One thing that's interesting to me is the balancing act. So if we're thinking about architecting a solution, or even architecting a house, or some thing that needs to have a consistent feel, it seems like there's a balancing act of having everyone help make decisions versus having someone with a vision keep things together in a way that makes sense and is consistent.
Yeah.
I see that's a problem I sometimes see with Drupal, right? It's like going in many different directions, where you might compare it to a CMS that had an architect, and it's it has a very finite set of paradigms that it uses, and you can learn it so much better. So that's it seems like a balancing act, because imagine if you had 20 people design a house, and everyone had equal decision-making capability, that house would be a mess.
Yep. Yeah, and that's just on the software side, where we're at least thinking about how we structure and make these decisions. Dries at least sort of sets forth some initiatives that are favored, but it's still a do-ocracy if no one steps up to do them. Doesn't matter, you can direct Acquia resources to a degree, but there's for everything that should happen in Drupal, it both needs to be saying he thinks it's a good idea, the initiative process, and for people to step up and do it. And so people can step up and do something, and it might not get into Drupal through the appointed core maintainers. But that doesn't usually happen. Usually if people step up and do a really solid job on something, like it is bottom up. And as you're saying, that can be an issue with the having a single vision and having a coherent result. But at least we sort of are trying and have a few things in place on the code side and on the community side, decision making about ultimately like people being allowed to go to different, use different resources that are Drupal and not are different. But I mean, Drupal is fascinating in that sense, in that it is still very much a do-ocracy. Like some of the major tools that we have used are not coming in any top-down form. When we were on IRC, people were just creating those networks and using it, and much later they were handed over, sort of to, in care of the Drupal Association appointees. And now everyone's on Slack, basically. Basically everyone's on Slack, and that is completely unofficial. Like the biggest communication channel is just people went and did it, which is an opportunity actually, especially for these kinds of doing a better job with governance decisions, because we don't have to go through Dries for that. Like, he's very busy. He's got a lot of stuff doing. He's doing a pretty good job with the whole vision for the project. To also, to the community governance side is too much. And again, this is something that most people agree with, but actual proposals for what to do instead haven't been coming up. But we can put practices in place in the areas that are already completely unofficial. It's been created, and it's a good opportunity, especially in Slack land, because most of the people who are sort of administrators there and taking on the community maintaining responsible role are very interested in issues of fairness and equal treatment. But yes, and since some of the proposed solutions, I'm going to talk a little bit about how you do figure out how to include a lot of people, but not have a vision that is 100,000 different visions. So, going back to the idea that people are the problem, it is not a new idea that those who seek power are precisely those who should not have it. This is a Pogo cartoon from the 50s, probably this one, but every 4 years, a bunch of this cartoon character's friends would try to get him to run for president, and he didn't want to, which is why he would have made a really good president. But the idea that, people who seek power are precisely those who should not have it is captured really well by Douglas Adams in basically the entirety of chapter 28, The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, is the quote that, one of the many major problems with governing people is that of whom you get to do it, or rather of who manages to get people to let them do it to them. It's a well-known fact that those people who most want to rule people are those least seated to do it. Essentially, people who are seeking power, you probably don't want them to have too much power. And it turns out, again, like I said, this is not a new idea that this is a problem. And as brilliant as Walt Kelly and Douglas Adams were, they were not the first to pose it. And in fact, the ancient Greeks not only thought about it, they acted on it and put a solution in place, which is called sortition, which is essentially rule by random lots. So the idea that you, in its sort of best form, and where they've run some recent experiments on, it's the idea that you pick someone at random who is not sought out the post, not nominated themselves, and several other people, so they can have deliberative process, but it can be quite a pretty small number of people, a small enough group that you can actually have a discussion, deliberative process, and give them the time and the resources to make the decisions on behalf of the larger population that they were drawn from. And this is pretty awesome because it removes the whole, it removes a huge number of corrupting chances. Like the whole election process, it's a question of who gets to be known, and that's a question of money, and it's a question of who has power to control communication. So you sort of you just cut out the entire need for a large-scale campaign to get people to pick sides, and you just take people who may be on whatever side and ask them to make the best decisions they can. And I'd come up with the idea for the process before I knew what the name was, in a sort of a different context, which I think is also absolutely critical, which is how to decide what communication gets spread to most people. Like, you don't really want to just completely rely on 20 randomly selected people to make all the decisions for some group of people in a year. That you need to have some way of there being feedback, knowing what they are doing, and all of that stuff. But so regardless of governance structure, whether you do sortition or elections or a dictatorship or anything else, you want people to be informed, to be able to think for themselves, and do the do-ocracy thing of acting on things outside of formal governance. And so for that, you need to be able to communicate with other people. And so the way to communicate with other people equally without there being so much noise that no one can pay attention to anything is to do a sortition-like process for the actual communications. Like, there's 100,000 people who are directly affected by some area of decisions in Drupal, or this community or the code. We don't currently have a way to communicate back and forth. We can throw something on Drupal Planet. If you're the Drupal Association, you can send it to those members. So that's the closest to sort of a communication distribution, and the decision's being made by a small number of people. And so whatever one thinks of cutting out the decision makers, cutting out elected decision makers from the process of the actual governing, the practice of having people who are of a much lighter weight version of rule by chance, rule by lot, is that of 100,000 people who are invested in a community. If one of them wants to send a message to all 100,000, you just ask a tiny sample. Don't like polling for political things in a lot of cases, but as a way of getting around, as a way of making the decision of what communication goes out to a large number of people, of what issues actually reach people, it's a nice little, it's sort of the only way I can think of that you can keep it open and fair. So you ask 20 people, should this information go out to 100,000? And they're not thinking like they are when they share something on Facebook. Is this going to be funny to some family members and not anger coworkers. They're not thinking, is this, going to go viral, or is this going to, is this important enough for it to get into the attention of 100,000 people, and people make the decision on that, and it's, very low risk, like low stakes, because it's just one communication, one at a time, and make the decision, but still bring in the idea of bring in the idea of giving people a little bit of extra time and resources to make the decision can do even more towards mitigating the problems of open source's structurelessness, of the problems of do-ocracy, which for all of its benefits, it still privileges those who have the time. So if you actually put in some way of compensating people for their time for the decisions affecting the community, that's even better. So that's one huge set of tools for helping decision making, and broadly under the category of sortition, rule by lot. And then the next tool, which I think can be used in some ways that are synergistic, is sociocracy. And this is snuck into corporations with the name holocracy and stuff like that, but it's exciting to find reasonably coherent theory of how to run organizations, and even communities in a way that can scale. So, democracy is the rule of the many, with the idea that if at least a bare majority approve of an action, even if that action is just electing a representative, that it has some legitimacy to have a bare majority approve of something. Whereas sociocracy, translated as rule of the associated, embodies the idea that all the people who have to carry out a decision, or if you extend it, all the people who are going to be affected by a decision, have to consent to the course of action. Everyone gets a say in the direction and conditions of their work, and this is in an organization, and trying to extend it to a community. There's some issues in scale, but that's where the sortition comes in. But everyone gets to say in the direction and conditions of their work. No one gets to say they're just following orders. The structure is, in their own terminology, a bunch of circles, each linked to one or more circles by double link. There's a member from one circle is representing their circle in the other circle, and then a member of that circle is representing it in the other. So, to put it in an example, if this were done in a Drupal community setting, if someone is on the let me know if I'm way over time.
You're way over time.
Okay.
I need to start in 6 minutes.
All right, yours up next. Okay, sorry. Thank you. All right, I'll wrap up very quickly. Thank you. Thank you. So double link. So I mean that's sortition and sociocracy, the two tools I want us to think about for democratic, for decision making and scaling decision making in the Drupal community. And the idea is that all decisions made within a circle are made by consensus. They call it consent because they want to making up another word to really emphasize that if you as long as you're not super opposed, you're going to let it pass. But everything that happens in these working groups are acknowledged and accepted by everyone in the working group. So it makes sure that everything that is every action that is taken is very much understood and agreed to by everyone. So the work goes much faster. And that's all. I will let you test it up. Sorry, but you can reach me at here. Thank you.